From the very beginning, you have these questions about causation. You have these questions about universalism. These are putting the reader into a specific horizon of expectation that situates Herodotus in this community of intellectuals.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. There's an idea in fiction writing that a story's first paragraph should, in a way, predict what's going to happen in the rest of the work, and that if the author is really, really good, that first paragraph is also going to teach you how to read the rest of the text. The famous interview between Solon and Croesus doesn't come up in the first paragraph of Herodotus' Histories, but I think that in lots of ways, it does the work of a really competent first paragraph. It predicts what will happen in the rest of the work, and critics have also identified several ways in which the scene is programmatic, or, in other words, how it teaches us to read the histories as a whole. So you might recall that when Solon is visiting Croesus of Lydia, and Croesus asks him who is the most fortunate person he's ever seen, and the word there is olbiotatos, Solon refuses to give Croesus the answer that he desires, Croesus himself. Instead, Solon offers examples of people who both lived and died well, and rounds off his observations with the famous maxim that we must consider the outcome of each matter and how it will turn out. So, one example of a recurring theme that this scene maybe predicts is that of the instability of fortune. When it comes to people and empires alike, what goes up may very well come down one day. There are other ways, too, in which Solon's words to Croesus have been read as a lesson that Herodotus teaches the reader. Herodotus, unlike Thucydides, didn't make contemporary events his subject, but instead chose to write largely about things that took place before he was grown. So the second Persian invasion of Greece probably had ended before he was off to kindergarten. One other way that Solon's response has been taken, then, is as a statement that you can only truly appraise the significance of historical events once those events are entirely complete. My guest today, Scarlett Kingsley, sees yet another Herodotean lesson in Solon's response to Croesus. In her book, Herodotus and the Presocratics, she argues that the Solon-Croesus scene is not just about the instability of fortune, but also about how we acquire knowledge. She highlights that when Croesus asks Solon to judge who is most fortunate on the basis of what he's seen in his travels, Solon actually rejects autopsy, so direct visual observation, as the criterion for truth. Despite Croesus's emphasis on sight in his questions about who Solon has seen who was most fortunate, Solon never refers to his own travels or personal experiences in his answer. And as Scarlett observes, this subtle distinction between seeing and knowing places Solon's approach, or Herodotus' approach, in dialogue with contemporary philosophical debates about epistemology. By having Solon value historical memory and reflection over empirical observation, Herodotus signals that his own historical project will go beyond mere reporting of what he's seen to engage with deeper philosophical questions about how we understand human experience across time. I thought that this was a really fun episode, and in particular, I love how Scarlett conceives of Herodotus' histories as a laboratory of historical action, and you'll hear a lot about that over the next hour. Scarlett Kingsley is an associate professor of classics at Agnes Scott College. Her research explores the intersections of early Greek historiography and philosophy, with a particular focus on Herodotus, Thucydides, and the Presocratics. Her first monograph, Herodotus and the Presocratics, Inquiry and Intellectual Culture in the Fifth Century, was supported by a Loeb Classical Library Foundation Fellowship. She's also the co-editor, with Justina Monti and Tim Rude, of The Authoritative Historian, Tradition and Innovation in Ancient Historiography, and that came out with Cambridge in 2022. She is currently co-writing a book with Tim Rude entitled Land, Wealth, and Empire in Herodotus, Reading the End of the Histories. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. Also, a little reminder that Lesche is on Instagram. The handle is @LeschePodcast. I'm thinking of starting to use that account more often to make carousels of images that we talk about in the episodes, since I've got a few with art historians in the pipeline. But in the meantime, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Scarlett Kingsley. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
I was an MST student in Oxford. I was in conversation with a fantastic classicist there, Tim Rood, and we were talking about, at that time, the dearth of work that tied not Herodotus but Thucydides to his intellectual context. Even though there's so much to do there, there's just always this recognition with Thucydides, in particular in his reception, even in antiquity, of his embeddedness in sophistic intellectual culture. But there hadn't been at that time, and there still remains in my mind, a gap in the research. So I started thinking about situating historians in their sort of context intellectually at that time. And then I transitioned over from my master's to my PhD at Princeton. I started working with Michael Flower and Christian Wilberg and Nino Laragi on the project, just as my advisors. And I had this very ambitious idea that I would do all of Herodotus and all of Thucydides, and that the book would treat authoritatively intellectual culture in 5th century. And if we think about Thucydides as an early 4th century historian, it would really advance our understanding of that. And I think I finished the Herodotus part, and that's all I could do, just because there was so much there. And I think there was so much there because there had been really a century where no one had looked at Herodotus as a thinker who was in dialogue with those figures we call Presocratic philosophers or sophists. So there was like an early German tradition of doing that long ago. And there was figures like Wilhelm Nestle, who in 1908 had been working on that. But really there hadn't been anything, substantial since that time. And so there was a lot to reconceptualize in terms of methodology in particular for me to figure out, how do I approach this today? And I had to also digest and think about the, at the time, still radical work of Rosalind Thomas, who had written this wonderful book in 2000, Herodotus in Context, and had really demonstrated, to my mind, two key revelations. One, that Herodotus has to be considered in light of his own period, and that's very much mid, to later 5th century, but also the idea that Herodotus needs to be considered as a thinker in dialogue with the medical tradition or with ethnography. And he's not just looking to this archaic worldview of Homer and Pindar. And I think she really moved the needle, and that allowed me to kind of go forward with my own work with that as a given, essentially. I didn't have to argue those things anymore.
Why do you think it is that there hasn't been as much work as one might expect on the intellectual context of both Thucydides and Herodotus? I'm teaching a seminar on Xenophon right now where we're just doing Thucydides' histories and then Xenophon's Hellenica and looking at as the completion and then continuation of the work. And we were sort of talking about how it seemed that a lot of Thucydidean scholarship is sort of solipsistic, like it just treats the text as kind of a closed ecosystem. And I assume that, I know Herodotus less well, but I assume that works are often sort of similar for that author. Why do you think that is? Is it just because these books are so big and difficult to wrestle with that it's like adding more would just complicate everything and make it all so overwhelming? Or what do you think it is about them that keeps them cordoned off?
No, that's a key question. I think, why is it that these readings of these historians been so, solipsistic is a good word. For me, in part, I think it boils down to this anachronistic view of genre and this idea that with Herodotus, and especially with Thucydides, you have this hard genre of historical narrative, which is ossified at that point, and which is in dialogue not with its contemporary kind of dramatic or the dramatic tradition or the philosophical tradition or the medical tradition, the oratorical tradition, but instead it's very much intradialogic. That is, they're talking to each other. So there's been this, question of how Thucydides responds to Herodotus, how Xenophon responds to Thucydides, Herodotus, but not really this willingness to say, well, is this really the case that these genres are so hardened? And in fact, even if they were, that they would be so hermetically sealed from their own historical moment? I think that's one thing, but maybe there's one other element that comes to mind right away, and that is the difficulty of working with the texts that you would need to become familiar with, because I think Herodotus is the best exemplum, such a full work of sophistic thought, but there's not a lot that you can deal easily with full texts. And so we have this Diels Kranz collection, the Die Fragmente der Vorsokratiker, and that collects the texts, and that's extremely helpful, but it's very difficult to work with, just because there's so many mare's nests in philosophy and how to interpret those, that it's uninviting. And I think that was a sort of difficulty for me to just grapple with the amount of material, but then also, how do you approach these figures in dialogue with a Herodotus in a way that's not going to ignite a firestorm from people who work on these texts from a philosophical standpoint?
Could you say a little bit more about how you deal with this question of genre in the book? It's certainly a red thread, this issue of the maybe anachronistic way that we look at, or teleological almost, that we look at historiography. So could you maybe talk a little bit about how you discuss this project of Herodotus's in terms of the generic landscape, let's say, of his own time?
One of the central aims that the book is making is that, when we talk about genre in terms of historiography, the historical narrative, or in terms of pre-Socratic philosophy or this, sophistic movement, that's very anachronistic. And that in that 5th century period, you just don't have a hardening of generic forms, and that there is a dynamic experimentation that's happening, in particular in prose, also to some extent in poetry, and that, there's modern scholarship on the emergence of genres, of new genres, and figures like Caroline Miller are at the helm of this research, and they argue that you have, combination and change and inversion, and that is how genres emerge. And she'll take something like, what's a new genre in our time? We might think about the blog as a genre, which emerged in the 90s, really. And where does it kind of come from? It's a little bit of a hodgepodge, to be honest. We could think of it, it's partly the journal, right? It's also maybe this idea of the cabinet of curiosities. It's like a day book. It has a set of discourses that it's drawing on, but it itself is creating something new with those discourses. And so I see historiography as fitting into that, in that it's not just that, Herodotus is solely in dialogue with philosophy. Absolutely. He's certainly thinking about, who wrote A Big War before me and how did they do that, right? I'm not saying that there aren't other figures in dialogue with him, and of course we would put Homer centrally there. But another sort of key community of thinkers who are also responding to Homer are these intellectuals, however we want to term them, the sophoi or the sophistae, and that he's very much sort of in terms of his experimentation, part and parcel with those figures like, let's take Hippias of Elis. He, like Hippias of Elis, they're experimenting with existing forms and creating something new. So, take the Synagoge. You've never seen anything like the Synagoge before Hippias, right? Orpheus, Homer, Hesiod, Musaeus, poetry, prose, foreign, and also, it's Greek at the same time. It's just he's experimenting in tons of other genres, but let's just take that as a work. He's very dynamic, and this kind of prose experimentation is what I see Herodotus similarly engaged in. That is, his work is very different from the fragments that we have of Hecataeus. So how then, when we think about that generic indeterminacy, where does the text lead us? And my suggestion in the book is that when you start from the very beginning, you have these, questions about causation. You have these questions about universalism. These are putting the reader into a specific sort of horizon of expectation, we might say, that situates Herodotus in this community of intellectuals in that mid to late 5th century.
Yeah, you do a remarkable job of showing how Herodotus had a lot of the same interests as these other people that we think of as the Presocratics and even the Sophists. I think maybe the last question that I have to ask you before we start moving through the book a little bit more is, how exactly are you envisioning the term Presocratics? What kind of work is that doing for you?
Yeah, it's very, as you know, and as your listeners know who've heard Christopher Moore and Joshua Billings talk, these terms are very contested. And it's, this 18th century term, which was popularized with Herman Diels. And to me, it is very much a case of it being very recognizable. But I think that there are problems with it, and I try to acknowledge those problems in the book. One problem for me is that when you look at the fragments that we have of the Presocratics in the Diels Kranz text, that it doesn't include very often, or in maybe as concerted a way as I would like, what I see as the huge investment that drama, tragedy, and comedy have in intellectual culture. And so that if we think about Presocratics just in terms of that text, which has been so foundational, I think it's really missing something. And this is why I think that, Most and Lax in the New Loeb edition are they're just so right to put that in there at the end as an integral part for us thinking about early Greek philosophy, that they belong there. And so I think that's a problem. And then Presocratics, maybe I would also say, although I use it, I think the other problem to be aware of, to be alive to, is that Socrates is in so many respects just very much a part of these questions that are being asked by figures, who Herodotus is very much in dialogue with Socratic questions on, for example, ethics. So and these are questions which are being raised by sophistic figures like Protagoras, like Hippias, like Prodicus. So I don't see Socrates as representing a distinctive break with the tradition that I think maybe pre-Socratic would suggest that, there's something really special about Socrates, and that those figures who preceded him were doing something kind of unique and different. No, that's certainly not the case. And it's also interesting that text goes well beyond Socrates. So I use the term pre-Socratic, but I think it's important to be alive to the limitations that term has, or at least just to be alive to the potential baggage that you might be importing. And I raise that to say, this term is extremely, I think it's so popular and well known that it makes sense to use it, but we have to be sensitive to what it might occlude.
That makes complete sense. And I'm thinking back to the conversation with Josh and Christopher when they were really, careful to say that it's not a periodization thing. It's not like there's the pre-Socratics and then there's the sophistic era or something, and then the Socratic era, that there's a lot of overlap and different ways that you could define these things and different ways in which the terms can be capacious or limiting. So I think that that's a helpful reminder. Well, if we turn to the content of the book itself, you start with what I think is going to be a very recognizable moment in Herodotus' histories for a lot of people, which is the interview between Solon and Croesus. And you see that episode, what you write, actually, I pulled this quotation, you write that as a programmatic episode, it provides a critical window into the horizon of expectation that what will become the genre of historiography carves out for its audience. Could you just say a little bit about why the encounter between Solon and Croesus is programmatic? I mean, not just for Herodotus, but for your work on him?
Yes, absolutely. I think what I would sort of start to preface this response to that question is that traditionally, when Herodotus has been thought of in terms of his own contemporaries, or in terms of his own method in relation to his contemporaries, he's been set against the philosophers. And he's been set against them on the grounds that they're engaged, many of them, it's been suggested, in work that is rationalist. That is, if we wanted to think like Hume, Leibniz, like this sort of, empirical rationalist, he sits on the empirical side, whereas the pre-Socratic philosophers, Anaxagoras is very much on this alternative side, which is interested in not necessarily what you can see, but what you can think, and what makes sense on the basis. Think about, also we might think about Parmenides. His way of what seems is not the way that is, or the way that's true. And so when folks have been interested in talking about Herodotus as a thinker, they've really stressed the differences that he has with the philosophical tradition by noting his interest in, for example, he discusses hearsay, he discusses his own opsis, his own autopsy. And I think that's absolutely right. He absolutely does do that. But there's a way in which that initial meeting between Solon and Croesus seems to me to point beyond empiricism as the sort of sole way we need to think about Herodotus's interests, his intellectual affinities, or the ways in which he wants his readers to approach his project. And so you have in this paradigmatic moment, Croesus, the Lydian ruler, who's welcoming Solon into his court. And of course, he shows him around his palace, and there's all this wealth there, which he's excited to show off. And then this primes him for his big question that he's going to ask, who do you think is the most fortunate individual? And who do you think that you've seen who's the most fortunate individual? And he keeps pointing to the site of Solon. And
yeah,
Solon,
you mentioned that, sorry to interrupt you, but
Please.
You lay stress on this term that in the question that Croesus poses, there's the emphasis on theoria or theoriae in Herodotus.
Yes, exactly.
Kind of a key term.
That's right. Absolutely. This idea that you would, travel for wisdom. And that's what Solon is engaged in doing, this kind of project. And so we might expect Solon to respond, given that we know he's been traveling and we know he's seen many impressive things, to respond with his own personal experience, but he doesn't, right? On both responses that he gives them, he gives to Croesus, he turns to instead Tellus, Athenian history, Cleobus and Byton, Argive, Delphian history, right? In both cases, he gives us what he thinks is the real kind of response that you can give, which is your understanding. If you're thinking about well-being, you don't rely on your own limited insights as a human being who doesn't live that long. You have a different kind of temporality that you should rely on, and that is after-lived temporality. And so he has this very special temporal way of viewing what is the most fortunate individual, and also just responding to that. He has this meta-historical moment where Herodotus wants us to read the text with Solon to say, okay, well, how do we think about these questions, these ethical questions that are going to determine Greek philosophy? How do we think about them? And we think about them through historical knowledge. This is the way that we can really get a handle on big questions about what it is to be a person who has a life that's worth living. And so I see that moment as really dictating for us the way in which Herodotus is reconceiving philosophical knowledge. That is, he's saying we can think about questions in a way which is radically different than I've seen, elsewhere, and that is by plotting them through the laboratory of historical action and seeing, what happens.
Well, actually, this was going to be my next question for you, is that I pulled that you write about the histories as this kind of documenting or a representation of a laboratory of historical action. And I was precisely going to ask you to speak a little bit about that really interesting phrase.
So the way that the Periphuseus genre, so an anachronistic term, but these pre-Socratic treatises later on, they get dubbed with being called On Nature. And the way that those texts run, from the fragments that we have from Anaximander to Anaximenes on down, they're not engaged in an inquiry into lived experience. So you'll have the discussion of the origins of the world order. You will have the discussion of the genesis of different animal, plant, human life. And it's a very zoomed out perspective. And you don't have that focused, human, how kind of do these ethical questions that we're thinking about, let's say, how do we talk about justice? Anaximander has a specific way to talk about justice. And Herodotus's way is very different, right? He'll take individuals and he'll point us through the trajectory of their lives and get us to, we might talk more later about especially the way that he describes the trajectories of different great kings in Persia. There's a lot of pressure on questions of justice there, and getting us to think about, what kind of norms should we espouse and what should we reject. So he's interested very much in lived temporality, but also the pastness of that temporality, which is what he sets up in the Solon and Croesus dialogue, right? You need to have looked to the end to be able to assess a question like, what does a just life look like? Where do we see injustice? So I see his intervention as being very distinctive in relation to what has preceded it in the Periphuseus genre, which is, as I said, it's very zoomed back. And he wants us to get much more specific.
Right. So in a way, he's in reaction to our dialogue with other intellectuals of the time. The histories is kind of seems like a way to be like, well, that's fine in theory, but let's look at what this stuff has looked like historically on the ground, and maybe what light the actual examples of people's lives or events could shed on these theoretical ideas.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's something we might also compare with contemporary drama. So I think Euripides is also using individuals. For example, if we, just to take one of the tragedians, Euripides does similar things where he uses individuals to explore philosophical questions. I think, for example, of this sort of triangular agon in the Phoenissae between Jocasta and her sons, and these questions that are, about self-interest and equality and rotation of power and the obsession with power. And so I see drama doing interesting things in parallel. But I also think that Herodotus in many ways anticipates what we're going to see in the 4th century when folks are turning, like Plato and Xenophon, to rethink, how do we create a philosophical genre that really speaks to these questions in the most pressing way, and they turn to historical dialogue, right?
Well, in a way, it's interesting what you're saying, and I hadn't quite thought of it like this, but now with your help and maybe with help from Aristotle and the Poetics, it's seeming like you have maybe these abstract philosophers who do it just all in theory here on one side, and then you have maybe what is kind of emerging as this method of historiography or historiographical genre, which is what Alcibiades said and did, over on the other side. And then somewhere in the middle, suspended between theory and real life, then is the creative space of the tragedians.
I always find this passage a little problematic because
I think it's insane. I think it's totally insane, that passage.
What Alcibiades said and did is often very philosophical.
Yes.
And in Plato and in Xenophon, Alcibiades' presence tends to raise really fascinating philosophical questions. And so I feel like this is not, I think, descriptive, right? This is a very Aristotelian prescriptive analysis of what's the distinction between these genres, which have now really hardened into two distinct forms of knowledge. And he's taking that cachet for philosophy. But I don't buy it. I find him.
Yeah,
really...
I mean, okay, so let's throw his like super ham-fisted, charting of poetry and history and universals and specifics out. But anyways, I guess what I'm getting at is it sort of just seems like an interesting continuum of these intellectuals who are living contemporaneously, and just, I guess maybe it's a simple and really banal observation ultimately, but just in terms of like this laboratory kind of, if there are these questions out there, the way that what we think of as these different genres have different laboratories kind of doing experiments, but around doing different kinds of experiments, but around some of the same questions.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's absolutely right. That's a key. That's absolutely a key insight. That in particular for me, it's recognizing that historiography should be put into this larger set of laboratories in the period.
Well, given that I have you on the line, I'm going to ask a question that I've always wondered. Do you think it seems to me that historically in the scholarship, it's been Herodotus and Sophocles have affinities and Euripides and Thucydides have affinities. What's your kind of feeling of, I guess, these huge corpora after all of the work that you've done?
Yeah, there's certainly the tradition that aligns, this later biographical tradition that aligns Sophocles and Herodotus. But I think, for my money, there's been good recent work that really pushes back against this distinction between the rigor of Thucydides, the kind of relentless mind of Thucydides, and the naivete of Herodotus. And I think that there's a legacy there that would also posit that, Euripides is new learning and Sophocles isn't. And I kind of want to push back against that and say, no, absolutely, Sophocles is totally embedded in these big ethical questions. And in the book, I talk a little bit about the Philoctetes as an example, where he's interested in pursuing these lines of thought about self-interest in relation to the individual in the service of the state, and how this maps onto what Herodotus is doing. But these are questions which would not be alien to a Euripides. And of course, Euripides has his own Philoctetes, who Sophocles is responding to. So I think that this harks back to an earlier tendency to view Sophocles and Herodotus as less developed, maybe, and maybe more gullible or maybe more naive than their successors in the genre, who are its full expression and also its perfection and its end, in the sense that it's met its acme with them. So I would resist, I think, seeing them in that light, mostly because Euripides and Herodotus are also contemporaries with Sophocles, and they're all kind of imbibing, I think, these same ideas. And so I guess I just don't see them as fundamentally part of different generations or part of different intellectual filiations. Right. That would make a hard line between Euripides and Herodotus being in dialogue.
Well, I think that this is something that I really love about this book, is that, you're unpicking this tendency that made its way into modern scholarship from certainly ancient precedents, but to just relentlessly want to map what you might think of as literary history on a chronological axis. There was someone who came before, and then someone who came in the middle, and then someone who came back to the problems with Aristotle again. And so I think that you're kind of looking at this, again, this intellectual milieu more panoramically or synoptically.
I was just going to say, I think one of the things that has historically been an obstacle to scholars who've been looking at these texts in dialogue is this obsession with dates. Mm-hmm. And looking at, and this is a very sort of very early 20th century tradition, but looking at ipsissima verba and looking at intertext and saying, if it's not there, then there's no connection. And looking at exchange, not in terms of ideas, but in terms of people. So that if you can't, trace a direct relationship from one thinker to another, they cannot have been in dialogue with one another. So just to give you an example, if you don't have the panton crematon, this man measure quoted in Herodotus, then he can't have been engaging with Protagoras on this, even though he discusses relativism. Or if you don't have Nomos and Thucydides opposed to one another, then Herodotus can't have been responding to those figures who are thinking about these concepts, even if we separate them.
Right. If you can't TLG it, then
exactly
it doesn't exist. Right.
So the book really pushes up against that and says, no, these are ideas that are dans le vent, and we don't need to sort of know the date of Herodotus's visit to Athens to be able to say that Sophocles might have been aware or been thinking about similar ideas. So I really want to push back against the fact that even you have to have specific thinkers who are both reading each other. I don't particularly care about that. I care about these ideas being part of this marketplace of ideas. That is, that they're kind of in the air and people are discussing them and they're disseminating through these different networks.
One of the big sets of ideas, I think, in the air of this period was this question of, you just mentioned nomos, phusis. We could think about this in terms of the rubric of relativism, which you use in the book. And I was wondering if maybe you could explain that a little bit, the Herodotus and these questions of which, you frame in modern terms, particularly in the appendices of tolerance versus relativism, and then strong versus weak relativism, these kinds of things. Maybe you could speak a little bit about those ideas and how they manifest in Herodotus using that really interesting moment of the constitutional debate in Persia.
Yeah. Maybe first, if I could just say, what is a cultural relativist? And then talk about that passage. So you, as a cultural relativist, Herodotus would be someone who thinks that, beliefs, values, practices should be understood and evaluated within the context of the culture in which they occur. It shouldn't be that another culture should impose its views on it. So this suggests that cultural norms are very context dependent. They're not, there's no kind of Archimedean vantage point from which you could stand and say, this is how it should be. This is a universal moral norm. So that's how I would define a cultural relativist. And I think it's important just to understand after that, how does that differ from what you might say is just a tolerant person? How does that get distinct? And I think a tolerant person would say something like, well, I think that ancestor ingestion is wrong, but I respect your right.
But you do you.
Exactly. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Where a cultural relativist would either say, I can't judge this on the basis of my own cultural standards, your practice of ancestor ingestion. It has to be evaluated on your standards. Or they might think, I do think that's wrong, but I recognize that my own understanding isn't really morally binding for you because you have a totally different intersubjective context that you operate from, right? So I just want to note that I see Herodotus as very much espousing the cultural relativism over tolerance. I just don't see any evidence that he thinks that there are moral universals that you could have. So he thinks morals are intersubjective, culturally determined, and those are the figures who really deserve to be able to say what's appropriate for society. So in the case of the Cilician Indians who practice incest or ingestion, yes, they're right for themselves, right? For the Greeks, right? They're practicing cremation, they're right for themselves. And there's nothing else, there's no other critique that you could give of one society or the other. And it's interesting because, in the constitutional debate, you do have this discussion of nomos and the contravening of nomos. In the constitutional debate, it comes after you have the suppression of this pretender known as the false Smerdis in Herodotus. And there's 7 conspirators in Persia, including one Otanes and Darius, the future great king, who are a part of this conspiracy, who've successfully eliminated the pretender to the throne. And so they come together after this and they discuss, there's 3 speeches by 3 of these conspirators, and they discuss what should we be governed by? What kind of constitutional system should we operate with? And Otanes is the first individual, and he gives this impassioned defense of democracy, or isonomia, this idea that everyone should be equal before the laws. And he's very anxious about individuals not being liable to communal norms in his speech. And he uses some democratic technical terms to discuss this. And then this harks back to why he's anxious about this, which is because you've had, right before the false Smerdis, this pretender, Cambyses, who's put some serious stress on nomos in his reign. And he's done it by asking the Persian jurisconsults to discover a law for him that's going to allow him to do what he wants, which is, in this case, he wants to marry his sister. And there is no such law. This is illegal. And we talked earlier about how, norms are culturally determined. So what he himself is able to get out of this, because the jurisconsults don't want to be murdered by him. And so they say, we found another law that says that the Persian king can do exactly as he wants. So it's, the ruler as the law. And this notion is what Otanes is responding to in the constitutional debate. He's anxious that this creates a position where you have an individual who can do exactly as they like and move outside of the bounds of what is decay or justice. Move outside of the bounds of what is nomos, but also whatever they do is paradoxically nomos. And so I found this passage really striking as a moment where you can see Herodotus is interested not only in the fact that nomos is binding for a society, but the way in which an individual with overweening political power, like a monarch, can put tension on this notion of, communal agreement and raise the problem of what happens when you have a subjectivist, that is a person whose own will makes their own morality, in power. And you see, I was arguing in the book that this is a concern that you also find in texts which are thinking about relativism and the problems in relativism. So you find it in the Clouds, for example, or you find it in the Phoenissae, this idea that if we, in the case of the Clouds, it's this idea of Euripides after he's come from the thinkery of Socrates, that if he can persuade people to a nomos that it's right to beat your father, then that can be a new nomos. And there's nothing underlying nomos but our communal consent, and that there's no objective good or objective sense of divine law underpinning. And that provokes this, moment where you have relativism rearing its head in a way that unsettles traditional norms.
Well, I think it's a really interesting reading of that famous constitutional debate, which people get excited about from so many other directions. But I think that looking at it from under this rubric of relativism and the questions that Herodotus is exploring through it is really exciting. Well, maybe we could move from relativism, jump over Phoenissae and buy the book for that, but move on to the question of epistemology. I thought your chapter on epistemology was really interesting. I'm curious about two concepts or terms that you use there. And I think that the first one is the idea of Herodotus's voice print. And I was wondering if maybe you could say a little bit about that, which I thought was a really kind of exciting concept.
Oh, I'm so glad. And I have to not take credit for this because this is not me. This is very much a fascinating and brilliant article by Carolyn Dewald in 1987, which is called Narrative Surface and Authorial Voice in Herodotus. And she talks about his unique voice print, and she discusses in the article what she calls his critical mode, which is this moment where he becomes, maybe more than the excavator of past truth, someone who's more interested in the difficulties of accessing truth. And I really started from this notion, which I too found really fascinating, of Herodotus as having different modes of engaging with historical data. And when it comes to this critical mode, what I found striking about this article by Carolyn Dewald was she explained it by reference to this beautiful metaphor of a Homeric warrior who's struggling in battle for the truth, and it's difficult to have access to, and it's this fight. And I thought, wow, that's a really fascinating image of what Herodotus is doing. And I don't disagree with that image, but I wonder what's the actual intellectual milieu in which he's coming out of. And this chapter really arose from that question. If we take away the metaphor, what's there? Where is this coming from? Is this coming from nowhere? Is this washing up on the shores? Is this just historiographies really fascinated with truth and with also recording the difficulty of truth? And what I found was that wasn't the case. It was much more complicated than that.
Well, speaking of the truth, you also use this phrase, grammar of truth, to discuss the ways that Herodotus seems to be engaging pre-Socratic thinkers, other pre-Socratic thinkers, around questions of epistemology. Could you say a little bit what you mean by grammar of truth and how that's operating in your analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, when Herodotus is talking about truth, there is, on the one hand, a real resistance to, he starts out and he says, there are all these stories, about why there's enmity between the Greeks and the Persians, and I'm just going to tell you the one who I know started to do injustices against the Greeks, and he uses oida. And starting out with that, you get the sense that you're going to have a sort of persona loquens, this narratorial voice who's going to be talking to you and giving you this authoritative kind of almost Thucydidean account where you've got the finished product, right? You don't get the peek in the workshop to know in Thucydides how things are going, how he's come to his decisions. It's really, it's a very sort of polished, finished product. Whereas Herodotus sort of gives you that impression with oida, and then it sort of very quickly falls apart and the wheels come off, and you get a sense in the laboratory, he has his own sort of workshop where you're initiated into how hard it is to get truth, how difficult it is. And so he'll say, it's likely that this is the case. I couldn't achieve certainty that this is the case. This is what we know at this time that this is the case. And he used sort of a real range, or, we might think of it as part of his grammar of truth, this real range of ways to express reticence and distance from I know, which, again, is what you're sort of primed to in the beginning. So it's certainly, I guess, the first half for me of the story with Herodotus is how reticent he is. And I see that as very much a part of this tradition of pre-Socratic fallibilism that you see in somebody like Xenophanes, who's so willing to tell us, how difficult it is to get truth, how we might achieve something better, but we don't have wisdom from the gods. And so knowledge is unreliable. We should suspend judgment. We should be reserved about the senses. These are all things that figures after Xenophanes and Xenophanes are thinking about. And I think Parmenides is, as I mentioned earlier, his sort of bifurcating paths are really telling, because he does have this way of doxa, or seeming, and that's one avenue. So he wants to tell you what seems, but what isn't true. And Herodotus, it seems to me, is very much in dialogue with that. That is, he's not just interested in telling you how it is, it's also, what it might be, or how it could be, and where the state of knowledge is now. And so I saw that as very important to position Herodotus in his own context, to think about that interest in complicating truth. But then the other side of that grammar of truth for me is when, in select cases, he is willing to tell us that, yes, there's something I absolutely know, and or to use language which is more hard and firm, like aletheia, or like in the book I talk a lot about his use of to aeon, or the domestication of this participle, which you see in Parmenides, in which he uses at key moments, including in the Solon and Croesus episode, where he says, Solon's not gonna flatter Croesus. He's gonna tell him the way it is, literally, like the truth, that is. So I see him, on the other hand, his grammar of truth is, there are these moments where we do have a way at getting at truth, and that is the goal. And it's not this proliferation of truthiness. He has a strong monologic sense of truth, but also that difficulty of accessing it. So that's the grammar of truth, as I see it, for Herodotus.
Well, I'm really happy to hear you use the word truthiness, coined by Stephen Colbert, one of my favorite personalities around. Yeah, but it strikes me as really interesting that Herodotus is, in a way, maybe confident enough to show us his struggling with that maybe there's oida, and then there's other ways in which he's having a hard time getting at it. Whereas if you took Thucydides at face value, in the methodology section, he also says, this is really, really, really hard. But with the suggestion that, but I did it. But I somehow managed. And because I was so diligent and worked so hard, I got there. And then Gorgias just saying, well, never mind, let's just give up. And I can show you how interesting it could be if we just gave up on this, because it's so impossible. Yeah, I love this idea of the grammar of truth, and the way that this is pointing us to these other authors, these other thinkers, and the kinds of questions that they're all asking and all struggling with.
Yeah, and I think Thucydides is very, he has this idea of the clarity, this idea of he's gotten something that's going to be sure that you can use, and it's diagnostic. But I would say for Herodotus, I don't know that I see it as him confident so much in the struggle, but I see it as a different way of positioning his own authority. That is, he's saying, much like these other thinkers who, in this period are the kind of intellectual rock superstars, I too am committed to telling you that there are things that I couldn't find. And when I do tell you something's true, you should really believe it, right? It's like there's a rhetorical power. And I think about a passage like in 7:139 where he says, you're not going to want to hear this, but the Athenians were responsible for the fact that the Greeks were able to push back the land invasion. And he uses aletheia there. So I think, in those moments, there's a real rhetorical oomph that comes to his stance.
Well, I guess my last big question then would be about where you end with this really interesting case of Herodotean reception, if you call it that, with the Dissoi logoi. Maybe you could just say a couple of words first about what is this text? What is the Dissoi logoi?
Yeah, it's a text that comes in the manuscripts of Sextus Empiricus. It's traditionally dated to the 4th century early 4th century by most folks. And it's a series of oppositions on for example, the seemly and the unseemly, That's one of the oppositions. And then it goes into, it sort of moves away from these Dissoi logoi, these divided logoi at the end. But it's interested in mnemonics, in the idea of kairos. It's very cosmopolitan. It's very capacious. It's got a finger on the pulse of sophistic movement in the early 4th century. And it's very mysterious. We have no idea who wrote it. There have been, as many scholars have produced that number of individuals who might have been the author. We have no idea who wrote it, as I said, but it's really fascinating because it does give us a kind of reading of Herodotus. I think it's one of the earliest. We might say Aristophanes is really early too. People say that about the birds, but I think it gives us a really early case of reception of Herodotus, and it's a reception of Herodotus as a figure who's a relativist, right? It's thinking of Herodotus as someone you draw on, and in this case, it's the seemly and the unseemly, or the kalon and the iskron, and it's this figure you would draw on when you want to make claims about, for example, in this case, it's the identity of these things. So, for example, he'll say, well, among the Thracians, it's noble to be tattooed for women, but among the Greeks, that's, they would run you out of town if you were, that's associated with enslaved peoples. And so he targets, the author of the Dissoi logoi, targets a lot of Herodotean passages, these ethnographic passages where Herodotus notes, what is eogenes, what's noble and what's not. And he pulls them and he puts them inside of this discussion of why he thinks these are identical in differing, in this case, peoples. So at the end, the Dissoi logoi, at the end of this, what's called the identity thesis, or the idea that these are the same things, the seemly and the unseemly. He even gives this very Herodotean conclusion where he adapts 338, this passage where you have this marketplace of nomoi that Herodotus discusses in the context of Cambyses. And Herodotus quotes Pindar as his coda to support this, and he has his own poet that he quotes. So he follows it so closely, and to me, it's a really fascinating early reception of Herodotus as a figure who's good to think with when it comes to one of these philosophical ideas that the book canvasses, and in this case, it's relativism.
I think it's so interesting that this is a text that then clearly is taking Herodotus seriously as a fellow intellectual. This is one of the texts that's always listed as like a sophistic text. So, and I think in a lot of ways that for this period, it's easy to be led by thinking, okay, when Thucydides says, I'm not going to have any of the mythodes, and that he's like subtweeting Herodotus there. And so to assume that people just think of Herodotus as like writing these fanciful tales and kind of reduce him to that. But I think your analysis, your account of the Dissoi logoi, shows, no, he's being taken seriously as a fellow thinker in this milieu, or sort of slightly after his lifetime. And that, to go back to your notion of the laboratory of historical action, that then there are other intellectuals who, to continue the metaphor, are using Herodotus' data.
Yes. That's beautiful. That's right. No, they absolutely are. And I think we could extend the project, and I didn't do this in the book, but I think that in Plato, you get this willingness to look at Herodotus as a competitive antecedent to the project that he's interested in. And I think about, the Critias Timaeus and the way he uses Solon and history there as a means of thinking about these philosophical questions. And I think about a text like Laws 3, where he gets to write his own Persian history and analyze what's happening in terms of constitutions in a very, a revisionary way that responds to Herodotus. So I think that there's more to be done on these topics, and that, absolutely, Herodotus's laboratory work was taken up by other individuals.
Well, thank you so much, Scarlett, for this conversation. All that remains, I think, is the word association game. Since you just mentioned him, I guess maybe let me start at the beginning in a way and say Solon.
Eudaimonia.
Presocratics.
Historiae.
Oh gosh, Historiae I have on my list.
Oh no!
So if I say Historiae, what do you think? You can't answer Presocratics.
Oh, okay. Historiae, I think wandering.
How about nomos?
Community.
And the last is Herodotus.
Presocratic.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Scarlett. Congratulations on the book. It was really fun to talk to you about it.
Thank you. This was really fun for me too.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.